This is Remembrance Sunday, when we usually remember soldiers who fought in wars long ago. But this year, of course, war does not seem far off at all. Since February, the war in Ukraine has dominated the headlines and affected all of us. There are Ukrainian refugees in our cities, and some of our churches have been helping them. The price of goods in our stores and at the gas stations have risen, influenced by the war in Ukraine. As Russia talks about using nuclear weapons, we of course all feel a chill go through ourselves, knowing that this could end badly for everyone. This year, war is not a distant memory, but something that is all too current and close. The news presents this war as the work of one deranged leader, but it also provides reports of terrible atrocities committed by Russian soldiers against the Ukrainians. Women have been raped by Russian soldiers so consistently that it's clearly a tactic of war. Civilians are targets. Many are shot dead on the street or found in mass graves with their hands tied behind their backs. War crimes abound. This is not just a war, but a sustained fugue of murder and atrocity. Not one leader, but many soldiers have done this, and we, of course, are horrified. We can't help but wonder, how can people do this to one another? Remembrance Day was inspired by World War I, another war defined by horror and atrocity. It was the first time machine guns had been used by both sides of a war, which resulted in escaping into the trenches, and it was the first time that lethal gas had been unleashed on soldiers. During the war, newspapers carried stories of these horrors. This prompted Sigmund Freud to address the question: how could civilized people be so cruel to each other? In 1915, the father of psychoanalysis wrote that the horrors of the front were not an aberration, but were actually human nature itself. Here's what he had to say. The war naturally prompted these individual citizens to withdraw for a while the constant pressure of civilization, and to grant a temporary satisfaction to the instincts they had been holding in check. Freud argued that the restrictions of once you strip away the restrictions of polite society, all human beings are revealed as they truly are, full of aggressive instincts and the capacity for terrible, terrible cruelty. The war had pulled off the mask, Freud argued, and now we were seeing humanity for what it really is. This pessimistic view of human nature was not new. Any Christian attending church during World War I would have heard similar messages from the pulpits, whether you were a Protestant or a Roman Catholic, and you would have been told that each one of us is born sinful. Protestants and Catholics alike subscribe to the idea of original sin, the notion that each child who is born tainted by the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And this gives us a moral weakness, the inability to choose good. We are easily convinced to sin, hurting others, and the only thing that holds us back is God's grace and intervention. This idea was an old one. It originated at the turn of the 5th century with St. Augustine. He argued that when Adam and Eve disobeyed in the garden, they were infected by sin, and their capacity for reason, for choosing the good, was actually corrupted, incapacitated. They could no longer easily choose goodness, but were inclined towards evil actions. Augustine argued that this moral failing was passed on biologically through sex from generation to generation to generation. In modern parlance, it was a genetic disease. And Augustine truly believed that every baby was born sinful, and only those that were baptized into the faith of Jesus Christ stood any chance of avoiding hell. And this was an idea that lasted well into the Middle Ages, through the Protestant Reformation, and is still with many people today. Augustine's view of the inherent depravity of humanity also had an influence on his ideas about war. If every human is born with an inclination towards sin, then we should expect humans to use violence on each other. Adam and Eve's oldest son, Cain, was the first murderer, and to Augustine this proved clearly the sin of the father and the mother had been passed on to the son. Augustine, like Freud before him, argued that states were critical for keeping a lid on all of these aggressive impulses. And it was Augustine who came up with the idea of the just war theory, which Catholics have been quoting ever since. We are bad to the bone, and only God's grace can save us. Augustine's pessimistic view of human nature might never have caught on with the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had it not been for the influence of war at that time. Augustine wrote his theory of human nature at the same time that the Roman Empire was falling. Rome had ruled the Mediterranean and up into Europe for 1,000 years. It was considered the eternal empire. Nothing could ever hold it back. It was the definition of civilization in the West. It was unthinkable that this sprawling empire, the pinnacle of human achievement and culture, could ever fall. But it did. Rome was conquered and overrun in the year 410. The kinds of war crimes and atrocities that we hear happening in Ukraine were just standard business of war at that time. The first Roman Catholic council to adopt Augustine's view of human nature was held just 8 years later, after the fall of Rome. To them, it appeared that civilization was falling apart in a paroxysm of barbaric violence, and it was just all too plausible that human beings were born sinful, bad to the bone. What else could explain this suicidal destruction of the world's greatest civilization? This Christian idea of human nature has been used to justify wars ever since. Yet we need to remember that back in the early 5th century, Augustine's idea was new. The psalm we heard today was written at least 1,000 years before Augustine. In it, we hear the psalm writer inviting God to probe his or her heart. The words are, "Though you probe my heart, though you examine me at night and test me, you will find that I have planned no evil. My mouth has not transgressed." Those are not the words of someone who was born soaked in sin. Indeed, the Hebrew Scriptures show no sign of Augustine's theory of human nature and original sin. One of the advantages of living in the 21st century is that you can use Google search technology on Bibles. And if you go into the Hebrew Scriptures and you search for the word Adam in the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll find that Adam is only mentioned in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, which is the story of the Garden of Eden, and then only in genealogies after that. Adam and Eve's sin does not cast a large shadow on the Hebrew Scriptures. It seems like it never even happened in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it doesn't appear to have been known to Jesus either. You may recall that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus declares, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus clearly considers children to be the ideal type of person, the kind of person defined by innocence and wonder, exactly the kind of people that we should all emulate as adults if we want to live a godly life. He certainly does not consider them stained by their inherent sinful inclinations. There's no hint of that there. So, are we born sinful? Are the atrocities of war just expressions of our inherent human nature? Or are they an aberration? I'd like to be able to claim on this Sunday that I could just pop open the Bible and give you a few more quotations and settle the matter once and for all. But unfortunately, those people who have pessimistic and optimistic views of human nature have been using the Bible to argue both of their cases for a very long time. So there's no way to settle it just by pointing to the Bible. The pessimists look at Genesis and some lines in Paul's letters, and the optimists point to Jesus. But we're not going to be able to settle the debate that way. So this morning, I suggest that we try something different. Let's look at the data of what soldiers actually do on the battlefield. Their job is to kill the enemy. Do they do this easily because they're born sinful, or is it difficult because they are not born sinful? Well, fortunately, we live in an age of data and studies and social scientists who actually look into what really happens rather than what we're told should happen. And during World War II, social scientists began to study what happens to soldiers on the battlefield. And one famous study found that even in the heat of battle, most soldiers either did not shoot their guns at all, or they shot into the air. When questioned, most said that they had no intention of killing anyone, despite a year's training firing at targets. Once they were on the battlefield, they didn't want to kill a soul. And this is odd, of course, because millions of soldiers were killed during World War II, so how did they die if no one was shooting at them? Well, how people died matters in answering this question about the essence of human nature. Here's a tally of the causes of death for British soldiers during the Second World War. Unknown or other types of death made up 1%. Chemical poisoning made up 2%. Blasts and crushes, 2%. Landmines, booby traps, that accounted for 10%. And bullets and anti-tank mines for another 10%. So if you do the math in your head, that makes up 25%. Bullets are put together with aerial with tank mines, and that's barely 10%. And if you want to look for the other 75%, it comes from mortar, grenade, aerial bombs, and shells. Less than 10% of all British soldiers in World War II were killed by bullets. Despite all the bullets fired, only less than 10% were killed by bullets. 75% were killed by weapons that were launched from a distance. Why is this? Well, in practice, it's actually very, very hard to get a soldier to kill someone that they can see. When you can see the eyes of the person you've been told to kill during World War II and World War I, most people wouldn't do it. During the Second World War, General Montgomery, known as Monty, wrote home stating, "The trouble with our British boys is that they are not killers by nature." During World War I, it's estimated that only 1% of all deaths were caused by the use of bayonets. You may remember from pictures and movies, right, of all World War I soldiers had rifles and they had bayonets at the end. Only 1% of deaths were caused by those bayonets. The movies show soldiers doing each other in with the bayonets, but in reality, almost no one used them. Shooting directly at people who you can see is very, very hard. It should come as no surprise then that the momentum of modern warfare has been towards using weapons which act at a distance. Drones, operated by people who aren't even on the same continent as the people that they're firing at. Artillery, mortars, We see this in the Ukraine war. The Russians have been destroying Ukrainian infrastructure at a distance. They've been using Iranian drones at a distance. It's very, very hard to motivate people to kill each other when they can see each other directly. Now, modern armies know all of this, and it actually changed the way they did target practice. Back in the old days, they did target practice with, that same sort of picture that you have for a bullseye and a dart game. They switched it to targets who look like human beings so that they could acclimatize people to shooting other human beings. And they've been given automatic weapons so that if you're in an urban warfare situation and you hear something threatening behind you, just a slight push of a button can spray bullets everywhere, and you can kill people who are hiding behind cars and walls who you can't even see. The kill ratios have risen since World War II, but so has the psychological damage. In studies of veterans from the war in Iraq, it became clear that people who kill others are much more likely to develop mental health problems when they come home. Killing someone else is the best predictor of contracting post-traumatic stress disorder. Killing someone else also increases the chances of suffering from relationship problems with your spouse when you come home, alcoholism, and thinking about and carrying out suicide. These risks are all increased when soldiers have killed a civilian. And the heavy psychological suffering borne by soldiers who kill is also seen among civilians who have killed either by mistake or on purpose. So it isn't something which is unique to soldiers, it's something which we find in the civilian as well as the military populations. The evidence, not the theory, not the theology, the evidence is clear. Even trained soldiers are not well suited to killing. It causes significant mental anguish which can last for years or even the rest of their lives. Those who can avoid killing others do so. Those who must kill often suffer mental health problems due to remorse and a sense of having perpetrated something which psychologists now call moral injury. They just know that they've done something deeply wrong. Even though they were allowed to do it, even though they had a license to kill, they come home feeling that they have done something deeply, deeply wrong. Human beings can and do kill each other, even when it's done to save others and their nation. But Freud and Augustine were wrong. We are not born killers, only held back by civilization. Instead, when the usual laws of civilization are withdrawn and we're given a license to kill, the violence we render unto others violates our sense of self and decency. That inner desire to do good can be seen even during times of violence. The only time that North America has been under direct threat of war, where it actually felt like it was at war on its own soil, was 9/11. I suspect we all remember where we were that day. On that morning, civilians in Manhattan were directly targeted in what looked like an act of war. And in the movies, when this sort of thing happens, panic ensues. Fear and civil disorder explode. People selfishly save themselves. People start looting stores while the police are distracted. Civilization just sort of breaks down and it becomes a free-for-all of people taking what they can. But in reality, 9/11 showed the most admirable qualities of human nature. In the World Trade Center towers, as they were burning, people had to escape. And civilians walked down sometimes 70 or 80 flights of stairs in an orderly fashion. All the people who went through that, they say everyone was walking calmly. We knew it was going to take a long time. There were disabled people on stretchers who were able to pass through the crowds as they walked down. No one objected to this butting in line. They said, "Oh, please, I'll get out of the way and you can go down." Some people even carried folks on their backs 60 and 70 floors of stairs. 1 million New Yorkers were told to go home, and with the subway shut down, the only way to do it was on foot. But there was little looting. The stores were empty. There was hardly any looting at all, and people opened their homes and businesses to each other. Off-duty firefighters and police rushed to the scene from all over the city. To get off the island, hundreds of civilian boats converged at the piers after the Coast Guard said, "We need some boats." A sort of Dunkirk-like evacuation, but achieved in a matter of hours, not days. Some of the people who wanted to help folks get across the harbor even saw the yachts that were in the marinas, and they broke into them saying, "Hey, we could put 100 people on that boat. The owner probably won't mind." And apparently rich people always leave the keys in the boat. Those yachts were used to ferry up to 100 people at a time across the harbor, back and forth all day long. The police kept people waiting for a couple of hours before getting onto the major bridges to Brooklyn and other places because they weren't sure if maybe the bridges would be a target. People didn't riot, they didn't freak out, they didn't panic, they just milled about for a couple hours until the police realized, okay, maybe it's safe, and then people streamed across the bridges. At the piers, civilians created spontaneous distribution centers for water and food and snacks for anyone in need. And these centers stayed in place for weeks after 9/11. And they grew. They ended up growing to include massage therapists. And people brought in hardware for folks to use at the Ground Zero site as they started the cleanup. All of this was spontaneous, created by civilians who simply wanted to help on a day where they thought their nation was under attack, their city had already been attacked, and yet they didn't flee from the danger, they converged on it. These acts of generosity at a time of war extended beyond Manhattan. Canadians in Gander, Newfoundland opened their homes to thousands of passengers when their planes were diverted and grounded. And of course, that became the plot of the fabulous Broadway show Come From Away, which Canadians wrote. In America, all over the country, donations to blood banks exploded, so much so that much of the blood was eventually thrown away. Far from fleeing from the terror, this threat to America's security highlighted our inherent desire to help, which is much stronger than our desire to hurt or even save ourselves. On this Remembrance Day, we are called to remember those who have risked their lives to protect others. We're called to remember their sacrifices, the risks and terrors which they faced on our behalf. And let us remember that they did this out of a desire to help. Their good nature, given to them by God, meant that when they were called to hurt others, even for causes which they were told and knew were just, they risked harming themselves. Not just physically, but mentally. Many came home from the wars unwilling to talk about what happened at the war. Children surrounding parents and grandparents saying, "Tell me about the war," and only being met with silence. I suspect many of you have that experience, that the people who've been in the war didn't come home with one great war story after another. They just chose not to talk about it. A veteran's reluctance to talk about those experiences and to remember it for others is often a measure of how much war asks us to deviate from our better natures. The best way that we can honor their memory is to work for a world where no men or women need to go to war at all. Instead, let us ensure that here and abroad, all peoples can draw on the loving impulse placed in us by God. May we build a world where war may be something remembered, but not planned for. Amen.